Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited. John Haynes, the man with nothing to lose. The man who rules the world runs into the irresistible force of a man with nothing to lose in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get the regular and variant editions of John Haynes, the man with nothing to lose on Amazon.com today. One of my viewers wanted me to do a video talking about how the baby boomers failed the generations of Generation X, Generation Y, Generation Z, and the millennials. And I wanted to go in depth on that subject, but I also wanted to talk about how the last three generations of black men and women are completely different than the civil rights generation. Now, the civil rights generation of the baby boomers, they grew up with the idea of integrating into American society, and they worked towards not the goal of getting equal rights as under our Constitution, but they started working towards getting towards the goal of white acceptance. And it was working towards that goal of white acceptance that I believe derailed the civil rights generation, because as they worked towards this goal of white acceptance, what happened was they stopped thinking about the future and they started thinking about what they could get for themselves. Because when you take a critical examination of most of your baby boomers, whether they be like your John Lewis all the way to your Barack Obama, they all have this mentality of I've got mine, F you. And that I've got mine, F you mentality that the baby boomer generation had is one of the things that has derailed the entire black race as a collective, because these blacks believe that once they got their civil rights, they could start working towards the goal of white acceptance, and that white acceptance had more value than tangible wealth. And because they got their corporate job, they got some of this welfare state money, or they got a little few crumbs from the master's table in some sort of position at a company, they thought that because they had arrived, everybody else would be able to arrive, and everybody should go out here and pull themselves up by their bootstraps, not understanding that white supremacy and racism are a part of the ingrained into this country's culture and the global culture, and that we cannot see ourselves as individuals, and we have to work together as a collective towards enriching each other and empowering each other. So that generation, it didn't think about enriching the next man. Instead, it had the whole idea of competing with the next man and the next black woman, and even worse, looking to undermine the next black man and the next black woman in a game of being the H-nice or the head N-word in charge. And they wanted to be this top black man as related to white people, instead of trying to build a community of black people with economic resources. And because they weren't thinking about building that community with economic resources and wealth, this is what led to all of these non-blacks coming into black communities and carving out economic bases in the community, because these individuals were so caught up in shopping in the white race stores run by racists that they weren't thinking about building up infrastructure for the next generation. And this is where your Gen Xers wound up becoming the latchkey kids, and they wound up having to fend for themselves. And then you had Gen Y having to fend for itself, and millennials and Gen Z fending for themselves, because the baby boomers were not thinking about the future. When they got on these jobs, all they thought about was getting for themselves, not thinking about, I need to, not when I get here, not only think about myself, but think about getting a position for other brothers, so that when we have more brothers and sisters in a business, we can then go out here and start building legacies like what we've seen with the Irish and the Italians with the police department and the fire department. Many of those jobs are graduated from father to son. And the reason why that's done is because those men and women who were Irish and Italian always thought about the next generation and the next legacy. So they wanted to protect their employment for the next son to come in, the next grandson to come in, and they wanted to ensure that wealth was going to stay passed down from generation to generation, not only with these jobs, but with their own economic base, because they also maintained their own communities. But your civil rights generation, they were more interested in building social currency than economic wealth. And all they were thinking about was being able to shop at these stores, being able to wear the clothes from racists like Barney's, and being this big shot like Ralph Ellison talked about in Invisible Man. And they weren't thinking about the next man who was their son or the next woman who was their daughter. They weren't thinking about building a legacy for the next generation or building inheritances for the next generation. It was all about them and all about them having now. As long as they had their Cadillacs, as long as they had their big house, they could care less about anyone else. And this is what did devastating damage to Gen X, because Gen X was the generation that had a hard time getting jobs, because I myself was a member of Generation X. I mean, even though I have the college degree, because there was no legacy to give me support, I couldn't find work and still struggling to find work. And Gen Y and Gen Z also are struggling because and your millennials are struggling because there's no support system for other black people. And we had to go out here and start building our own support system because the baby boomer generation failed to do so. And when we look at that generation of baby boomers like your Barack Obama, they failed us because they didn't look out for the next man, because it was all about them. And because it was all about them, they didn't think about things like Barack Obama and protecting black people's civil rights. And many of these black business owners, they were so busy trying to find white acceptance, they weren't thinking about building black businesses like Wood Johnson, who ran BET, didn't think about, hey, I could use this network to employ other black people and then create content for the next generation. So they weren't thinking about the next generation. And our generations had to start thinking about doing things ourselves. And because we had to start thinking about doing things ourselves, we couldn't look at that previous generation and see people we respected, because that generation gave us the middle finger with their I've got mine, F you mentality. And when we saw that I've got mine, F you mentality, we started to say, we can't think about I've got mine. Once I get mine, I've got to give the next brother a hand. And that's the way I think because of what I've seen. When I see another brother, I've got to give him a hand, because the more people standing on the platform, the stronger that platform is, and the more black people with economic power, the more stronger the economic base. And that's the thinking that many of the Gen X generation, the Gen Y generation, Gen Z generation, and the millennials are. And these generations don't have that whole I've got mine, F you mentality, and they also don't have that whole passive I'm going to be this good, forgiving Christian, and I'm going to turn the other cheek. That's something that I'm seeing evolve out of black people, and I'm seeing more and more, especially with millennials and Gen Z, a growing warrior class of black people ready to stand and fight, because I no longer see the whole passive, I'm going to just forgive whatever egregious action people participate in anymore from black people. And when I look at incidents like the George Floyd protests, I'm seeing that passive, I'm going to be this good Christian and turn the other cheek mentality eroding from black minds. And I'm seeing a growing warrior class of black people ready to fight to build a stronger black community. So one of the more interesting things I've seen as related to the failure of the baby boomers is this adaptation and evolution over the last 3 to 4 generations of black people, is that instead of us being passive, I'm seeing more black people being active, and this activity is focusing on building a stronger black community and focusing on building things as related to building a base for black people, because I'm seeing more and more black people saying we can no longer rely on these baby boomers or their legacy of cowardice, their legacy of selfishness, and their legacy of greed, and they're focusing more on trying to get towards building something for black people and standing up for black people, because I'm seeing, again, a growing warrior class, because people are tired of sitting there and tolerating injustice and tolerating oppression, and they're saying there's no place for it, because if they can't get, if there's no more I've got mine, F you, it's we're going to get ours, and we are going to go out. If we cannot get it given to us, we are going to take ours. And that's the mentality I'm seeing from this next generation, is they don't have the fear of the civil rights generation, nor do they have this quest for social acceptance, and they're more about themselves, and that's a positive thing, because if everybody else is out to go out and look out for their group, why is it wrong for black people to go out and look out for their group? So I'm seeing more and more of these, especially of the youngest generations, a completely different frame of thinking than the civil rights generation, and a lot of that, again, comes from what the selfishness of the civil rights generation and their inability to provide a legacy for the next generation. So since they didn't give us a legacy, people are taking their own legacies and they are working towards carving their own legacies. And that's, again, one of the more positive things to come out of these future generations, is they were able to adapt and change and realize that the failures of the baby boomers could not be their failures, and that they cannot be supporting these baby boomers and their ideas, because the baby boomers' ideas of just be looking for acceptance is nothing that's going to work, because if you can't get, if they won't accept you, then they have to respect you. And the whole thing is, we see more black men and women looking to take their respect and take their place in American society. And we're seeing more and more black Americans no longer afraid of white supremacy. And that's the thing that has many of these baby boomers terrified, because they get their bread and butter from white supremacy. And they know that if this next generation comes up, then their place in society is not going to be a comfortable one anymore. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.